Michael Bender, White House reporter with the Wall Street Journal, Annie Carney, White House reporter for the New York Times, and Melanie Zanona, congressional reporter for Politico. Good evening and welcome to you all. Annie, I'd like to start with you with another clip from this Fox News interview. Here is how the president might view the sworn testimony of one Mr. Bolton.
Why not call Bolton? Why not allow him to testify? This thing is bogus. Why
I would have no problem other than one thing.
Are you going to invoke executive privilege?
Well, I think you have to for the sake of the office.
So for future presidents, Annie, this is not the first time we've heard this. Are we to take this that the White House perhaps would not welcome John Bolton being sworn in?
I mean, they've made it clear that they don't want witnesses. Mitch McConnell has made it clear that his strategy is hand in hand with the White House, and his strategy is to avoid calling any witnesses. But one thing, Nancy Pelosi's stalling technique, she did not get everything she wanted by holding up the articles of impeachment. But one thing that did come out of here was during these weeks, we found out that Bolton is willing to testify. And that makes Mitch McConnell's job of saying there will be no witnesses slightly harder when now it's not a theoretical question. It's a real person with real information we haven't heard before who's willing to come and talk. And he has to provide a reason of why that he doesn't want that to happen that makes any sense. But yes, Trump doesn't want Bolton to testify. The White House has held up everyone from testifying, and that is the lead that Mitch McConnell is following.
Hey, Melanie, let's talk about Susan Collins of Maine, mostly because it's just so much fun to talk about Susan Collins of Maine. She's in a very tight spot. She is not alone among that group of vulnerable Republican senators. How does a Susan Collins find a way to say, you know what, we're good, we don't need to hear from Bolton?
I think it's going to be really difficult for her and other vulnerable Republicans who are up for re-election to say we don't need to hear from witnesses, especially with someone like Bolton, who, mind you, has a book deal. So some of this information could be coming out anyway, and it could backfire on her down the road with her voters if something salacious and damning does come out, and she wasn't pushing aggressively. But right now, it seems like she's given herself a little bit of an out by saying we're going to punt the question of witnesses to further down the road, but she is leaving the door open to calling witnesses like Bolton in the future. She told some local reporters today in Maine that she's working with a handful of other Republicans to ensure that witnesses are called. We just don't know yet who she would support and whether there would be enough support from other Republicans for that to actually happen.
And Michael Bender, it is occurring to people who saw your byline today and the piece below it that your piece drawing the first link between impeachment and the airstrike in Iran really gets to the nub of impeachment itself, the use of U.S. foreign policy toward a political aim or goal.
Yeah, definitely, and gives a little bit of an insight into how Trump is thinking about this, both issues, quite frankly, and this also just sort of opens up a bit of a Pandora's box for Trump. Iran, I think there's going to be a couple of storylines coming out of this. One is we've sort of backed away from the brink of war here, but there's an open question of where the next, when or if there'll be another military escalation. The second one is whether or not Trump bent the intel here to justify his own action. I mean, it's hard to overstate what that would do or what a big piece of Trump's political brand that is. Mm-hmm. I mean, I just like to remind you of 2016. Everyone remembers how Trump took down Jeb Bush, and everyone remembers calling him low energy. But the policy that Trump really tied around Jeb's neck was WMD's and his brother's decision to go into Iraq based on faulty intel.
Absolutely. Annie Carney, tell us about what you know to be the president's immediate foreign policy circle these days. And please add your reporting today on Mr. Kushner.
Secretary of State Mike Pompeo clearly won the battle. There was a rift in his foreign policy circle between John Bolton and Pompeo. Pompeo won that battle and is very close with the president. O'Brien, the new national security advisor, is close with Jared Kushner, is close with Pompeo, is close with the president. Esper is also a former classmate of Pompeo. So this is a group that's tight amongst each other and have the president's ear, and don't, unlike previous people who have held these jobs, aren't challenging him in the same way, or are more going along and trying to enact what he wants. I wrote a story that was in today's paper about a voice that has been central to Middle East policy since day one of this administration, Jared Kushner, the ubiquitous son-in-law, who has been notably absent from anything to do with this Iran strike, from the whatever planning, seat of the pants or not, that went into it, to the meetings in the Situation Room afterwards. He hasn't been there. And that's a sign. That would have been not the case in the first 2 years of this administration, especially when Tillerson was the Secretary of State. But now we see that Jared's role in the Middle East has receded as people who the president trusts more have taken on the actual official cabinet level jobs on the foreign policy team here.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.